We good? Test one, testing one. Are we live? Hello, live. We are glad that you're back. Can I get somebody at the back of the auditorium and get those doors? Thanks, Roy. Appreciate that. We're going to be back in the book of James. Again, I want to say a special thank you to Craig for filling in for the class these past couple of Sundays. Had a couple of great lessons and some really good thoughts out of the book of Philippians. I really appreciate him filling in. I'm going to go back to the book of James, which is what we were studying prior to my couple of weeks off. So we're going to be in James chapter 3. James chapter 3, if you want to follow along in your own Bible. True story out of Niagara Falls, New York. Evidently there is a man there in Niagara Falls, a small town, a man named Neil. And he's a kind, lovable kind of guy, but he's considered by most there mentally to be, just a little slow, simple-minded. Well, some people in the town are in a habit of coming up to Neil, and they offer him the choice. They'll have in their hand a dime and a nickel. And they'll tell Neil, you can take whichever one you want. Neil, which one do you want? Well, Neil will always take the larger coin. He'll always take the nickel. Well, finally, there was one person in town, they just couldn't take it anymore. He got tired of people taking advantage of poor Neil, so he pulled Neil aside and he said, don't let these people fool you any longer. The nickel, it might actually be bigger, but the dime is worth twice as much. And Neil whispered to the man, I know. But if I start taking the dimes, they'll stop offering money. Some people call him simple-minded. Others might call Neil wise. Which leads to the question I want to begin with this morning. Give you a few seconds to think about this. Just answer it to yourself. Who do you consider to be the wisest person that you know? Okay, I'll give you a second to think about that. Get somebody in mind. Who is the wisest person that you know? All right, you have that person in mind. The second question is a follow-up. What criteria did you just use in order to make that selection? In other words, when I asked you who's the wisest person you know, and gave you a second to think about it, and you came up with a name, you came up with someone, what criteria did you use to come up with that person? What about that person caused you to think, yeah, that's probably, I would consider that person to be the wisest person that I know? Maybe you used the criteria that many in today's world use when they look to establish wisdom. In a sense, I guess, there are tests for it. There's an IQ test that measures intelligence. There's a paper test, meaning how many educational degrees does that person have. There's in a sense, a verbal test. Does that person demonstrate a shrewd mind with their large vocabulary or their quick wit? And normally when I think about, who's a wise person that I know, normally that's probably pretty much the criteria I would use. A wise person is somebody who has a high IQ, they've completed X number of years of studies, and they have a master's degree or a doctorate degree to show for it, and their wisdom is demonstrated on the job or in conversation where their sharp mind is being made evident. Well, what's interesting about that is the definition that I just gave you, that I might use in trying to determine who I consider to be wise, and maybe it was the criteria you used when I asked who the wisest person you know is, that criteria for wisdom has nothing to do with the definition of wisdom God gives. We're going to notice this morning in James chapter 3, the Lord's answer to the question, who is the wisest person you know? James 3 verse 13. Who's wise and understanding among you, James says? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. What does God through James say about true wisdom? Well, what God says is a truly wise person, doesn't show that wisdom through tests or large vocabularies or university diplomas. But what James says through the inspiration of God is real wisdom is shown how? You want to find a really wise person? True wisdom, according to God's definition, is someone who lives a godly life that is filled with good deeds. And what James is going to do in our text this morning is he's going to contrast these two types of wisdom. Right? He's going to contrast godly wisdom, God's definition of wisdom, with earthly wisdom. Okay, he's going to contrast the two. Notice his commentary on earthly wisdom beginning in verse 14. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom, in quotations, does not come down from heaven, but it's earthly. It's unspiritual. It's of the devil. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you're going to find disorder and every kind of evil practice. What is James saying there in those verses about earthly wisdom? Is it wrong if you have a high IQ? Is it wrong if you're in a situation where you've been able to pursue educational degrees? Is it wrong to be smart? Well, that'd be great for me. There's one command I wouldn't break. Thou shalt not be smart. Got one. That's not what James is saying, though, is it? The wrong isn't found in the earthly wisdom itself. The wrong is found in the way we use it. I want you to notice that James twice in these 3 verses talks about selfish ambition. The selfish ambition that can be associated with earthly attainments. The Greek word translated as selfish ambition was used in Jesus' day to describe a politician who was seeking only to promote himself. He had campaigned for this political office not because he was interested in serving people, but he had campaigned and he wanted this office because he wanted the prestige and the power that went along with being in that office. And we see evidence of that everywhere around us today, not only in politics, but you see that in every walk of life. You see people who are doing what they're doing in order to do what? Promote themselves. People with the opportunities for educational advancement, people who have degrees hanging on their walls, who are many of them using their wisdom to serve? You see, many times lifestyle and bank account and unchecked ambition for more point to the fact that their wisdom isn't really wisdom at all. Because what they have been given, they're using to serve only themselves instead of the God who gave it to them. Again, verses 15 and 16, that wisdom, such, quote, wisdom, doesn't come from heaven, it's earthly. It's unspiritual, of the devil. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, in other words, if you're using the smarts God gave you and you're only concerned about selfishly accumulating and taking care of, and you're only looking inwardly and using those gifts from God as a way to promote yourself and care for yourself, you're going to find every kind of disorder and evil practice being done by a person who's motivated by those things. These words in James remind me of some words that Jesus spoke in John chapter 13. John 13, beginning in verse 1, it was just before the Passover feast, and Jesus knew the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. And having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of that love. Evening meal was being served. The devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray Jesus, and Jesus knew the Father had put all things under his power. He had come from God and was returning to God. All right, you have Jesus sharing the Last Supper with his disciples. And as you read the text and as you've read the verses and chapters prior to this, you know the forces of evil have been collecting for months, and they are now in a position to take Jesus' life, but we're not afraid as we read these verses, because what does verse 3 think? The Father had put all things under his power. All right, so as we read these verses, we know all the things that have led up to this, and the Jews are trying to get an opportunity to take his life, and they're going to use the Romans and the Roman rule to bring about their crucifixion, and we know all these things are happening, but we're reminded in verse 3, but all things have been put under his power from the Father. So Jesus is more powerful than Satan. And so on this occasion, what do we see? We see him get up from the table, and the one who's just been identified as the one who has all power and authority, he walks over to his disciples, and what do you expect? Well, since you've just been told that the Father's put all things under his power, if you don't know the rest of the story, if you're reading it for the first time, you've been reminded of the great power of Jesus. And so he walks over to the disciples, and you might expect what? Fireworks? Maybe some kind of awesome display of this power, some final showdown with Satan. But instead, the one who has this incredible power does what? Gets up to the meal, takes off his outer clothing, wraps a towel around his waist. After that, he pours water in a basin, and he begins to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. The one who has been given all power and authority from the Father does what with that power? He washed feet. What could he have done with that power? Anything he wanted, right? If he had so chosen, he could have put himself in a position where he bought comfort, where he bought fame, where he bought fortune for himself. But instead, all that power and authority given him by God, he used to serve others, to meet the needs of others. And then what happens? He goes on to tell us to do exactly the same thing. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I've set an example that you should do as I have done for you. All right, combine that example of Jesus in John 13. Combine that with the words that we're looking at in our text today in James chapter 3. And when you combine those two things, I think you can draw this conclusion. The wise man or woman is the one who uses the opportunities and the power and the strength God has afforded them to serve Him instead of just serving themselves. That's what Jesus did, right? He took all authority given Him by God, all the power, strength, and opportunities given Him by God, and instead of using all that just to serve Himself, He used it to serve others. That is, according to James, true wisdom. True wisdom is using the opportunities and power and strength God has afforded you to serve Him instead of just selfishly serving yourself. Now, you can have diplomas, and you can have degrees, and you can have educational certificates on the wall, and you can still do that. You can use what's available to you to serve God and live your life for Him. At the same time, however, worldly wisdom can lead you to selfish ambition. And you can have those degrees on the wall, and you can have those certificates and everything else that you have earned. But if you're allowing that to lead you to selfish ambition, you find yourself only serving and living your life for you. James touches on this idea of the one who's truly wise, using what God has given them to serve Him back in our text. Who's really wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. A truly wise person is going to be a humble person. I could almost guarantee you, if I went around this room right now and I asked you, who was it that you chose earlier in this lesson when I said, who's the wisest person you know? And you finally got someone in your mind and you picked someone. I can almost guarantee you the person you picked is humble. Can almost guarantee you, because wisdom and humility go hand in hand. The truly wise man or woman is humble. Some versions of the Bible translate that as meek. The Greek word there is the word praus, and it's a word the Greeks used to refer to a wild animal that had been tamed. And I want you to think about the meaning of that word for a minute. What does it mean to be humble? Well, the word's roots, it came from the Greek word praus, and it's a word that was used to describe an animal that's been tamed. All right, get this picture in your mind. Let's say a man goes out west, and he's out there before there's big cities and highways, and he's out west, and as he journeys, he just spots this beautiful wild horse. Just beautiful wild horse running around free on a range. And he looks at that animal, and it's just beautiful. It's powerful. It's full of energy. But it's useless to that man as long as it's wild. As long as that horse is wild, it's not going to carry him on its back. It's not going to be able to pull a cart, a load of any kind. It's useless to the man as long as it's wild. Well, the man's able to capture it, and he puts it in a corral. And he finds a cowboy who has experience breaking horses, and that cowboy bridles that horse and saddles him, and he mounts, and that horse bucks and bucks, but he stays on, and after a while, he's able to bring that horse under control. That horse has been tamed and is now useful for the man. Get that picture in your mind when you see the word humble or humility, because that is the Greek word, what it means. A wild animal that has been tamed. And that's the word, notice again in our text, that James is using to describe someone who has true wisdom. They are the ones who, in a sense, have been tamed and brought under God's control. They are now using their power to serve God instead of serving self. All right, look at that stallion again. That trained stallion is no less a stallion after he's trained, right? Still a stallion, still powerful, still strong, still full of energy. It's just now that power and strength is being directed toward doing his master's will. Well, in much the same way, the person of wisdom is being asked in their meekness or humility. They're not being asked to be weak or deficient in courage. God, by using this word, is saying the person of wisdom, they're still going to be powerful just like the stallion. They're still going to be strong, but now that strength is going to be under his control. So that they're no longer using that wisdom selfishly just to gratify themselves. Instead, they're using that strength selflessly. They're now putting God's desires above their own. Think with me for a moment about some of the Lord's apostles. I think they were good examples of this process. Think of these ones who at one time were using power to serve themselves, but in the end, they turned that control over to God and started using that power and strength to serve him. How about one of the apostles named Simon? Not Simon Peter, but Simon the Zealot. You know who the Zealots were? The Zealots in the first century Roman world were a group of Jews who hated the Romans and promoted violence as a way to release themselves from Roman rule and oppression. That was a zealot. It was a group of people who actively sought ways to violently free themselves from Roman reign and oppression. So Simon, when he became a disciple of Jesus, prior to that, he had been a zealot. That's the way he's described, Simon the Zealot. And yet, when he came under the power and direction of Jesus, all that power and energy he had put toward being a zealot and overthrowing Roman rule and authority suddenly was turned a different direction. He wasn't using that power and authority any longer to serve him and his cause. He started using that power and authority to serve his Savior and Lord. How about James and John? Remember the occasion, Matthew chapter 20, they come to Jesus and their question is, hey, when you become king, when you set up your kingdom, we'd like to sit at your right and your left. We want the top spots in your kingdom. Now you tell me, do you suppose that they were doing that because they thought that's what was best for the Lord's kingdom, or do you think they were doing that because they thought that might be best for themselves? I think at that point in time, they were being motivated by selfish ambition. They wanted those positions because of the power and the prestige and authority that went with those positions. How about Matthew, tax collector? Job in Jesus' day carried with it a lot of power and authority. Unfortunately, Matthew, if he was like other tax collectors, and we have no reason to believe that he wasn't, he probably had used that power to serve himself and his bank account as opposed to using that power to serve God. So what did Jesus do? Jesus took those men. He didn't strip them of their strength. He didn't take away their power. He instead, like that wild stallion, he tamed them. He taught them humility. He taught them meekness. He taught them to use their strength for God instead of using it selfishly for themselves, which is exactly what you see them doing in Acts chapter 2 and beyond. On that occasion of Pentecost in Acts 2, Peter stood up with the 11. He raised his voice. He addressed the crowd, fellow Jews, all of you who live in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say. We know the story. Peter stood up with the other 11 apostles. He proclaimed that first gospel sermon. And from that point forward, what do you see happening in the apostles' lives? From that point forward, the strength, the opportunity, the power, the authority that had been given to those apostles at that time, from that point forward, it began to be focused on them doing what? Their will or God's will? Primarily, it was focused on them doing God's will. No longer were they concerned with conquering people for their own sakes. Instead, they were concerned with conquering people for the sake of Christ. And again, that's not a job for the weak. That's not a job for those who lack courage. It is a job for the meek, for those who are strong and powerful, but whose strength now has been placed under God's control. Going back to our text, James is going to elaborate on this. The person of wisdom is going to look for the needs of others instead of selfishly looking to and thinking only of himself. The wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, it's considerate, it's submissive, it's full of mercy and good fruit, it's impartial and sincere. Go back to the question I asked you at the beginning of class. Who is the wisest person you know? What James teaches us in this passage is not to base our conclusion on anything except a person's willingness to humbly live their lives for God. If you find someone who is humbly living their life for God, that person, by God's definition, is wise. The one who looks for opportunities to serve Him, the one that uses their resources to bring glory to His name, that person is truly wise. The unknown author of Psalm 111 may best sum up our message this morning from James. Psalm 111 and verse 10, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. All who follow His precepts have good understanding. To Him belongs eternal praise." Those who fear God and strive to live by His commandments according to God, that is true wisdom. True wisdom according to God is those who fear Him and in humility live by His commandments. Those people are truly wise. And that's why it's kind of interesting when you focus on and you contrast the world's wisdom and God's wisdom. Because the world's wisdom, by their definition, you wouldn't necessarily expect to see a farmer sitting on a tractor necessarily by the world standards wise. But he certainly can be. By God's standards, a wise person can be found in the executive chair in an office or also seated on a tractor. A wise person, by God's standard, can be a professor at a large university or the keeper of a small daycare. True wisdom can be found on the college campus, and true wisdom can also be found in the home of a man who never finished grade school. Because true wisdom isn't measured by IQ tests or diplomas. True wisdom is measured by our willingness to live our lives for God. There's one more verse up there, Noah. That was it. Who's wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. Who's truly wise and understanding among you? The person who's demonstrating that wisdom by showing that their power and strength has been brought under God's control. That they, in humility, are not using the things that God has given them just to serve themselves, but they're using those things to serve others and bring honor and glory to the one who gave them those gifts in the first place. Who's truly wise? The one who shows by his good life and the deeds being done in humility that his wisdom is from God. Let's pray together as we close. Father God, you are indeed such an awesome God. I praise your holy name. Father, I thank you so much for this New Testament book that we call the book of James, for these practical insights, Father, into what Christian living is all about. And Father, today, just the reminder of what true wisdom is. Father, help us not to allow the world to define wisdom for us. Help us to allow you to give us the true definition. Help us to recognize it really has nothing to do with the way that the world defines IQ or diplomas or finance or anything. It simply has to do with the man or woman who's willing in humility to demonstrate a godly life, to follow you and your commandments, to allow the strength and opportunities and power you've given them to be brought under your control, and to use that not just to serve themselves, but to serve you. Father, each one of us listening online, each one of us in person, that's what we want to do. May we demonstrate true wisdom this week by allowing you, Father, to work in our lives, to put our strength under your control, to truly be meek and humble people. That wild stallion, Father, that's been contained, we still have all the power and energy. We just don't want to use it to serve only ourselves. We want to use it to serve you. So help us this week, Father, to see those opportunities, to put ourselves under your control and to look for those opportunities. And when they arise, Father, may we use what you've provided to show true wisdom. to show the people around us that you're alive and well, and that we don't live selfishly as so many in the world do, but we live to bring honor and glory to the one who has blessed us through Jesus. We pray these things through his name, and amen. Thanks, guys. Have a good week. Appreciate you staying.